one of the words that I was thinking about, the concepts I was thinking about as you were speaking, is the concept of libertarianism. That there have been certain group or groups who have been trying to push Israel in a more libertarian direction. Moshe Feiglin is known for that. On the other hand, it could be that what he's advocating is essentially a combination of the individual and the national, as you were describing, as one of the options. The combination of that, because he even in his platform, his philosophy, it's basically it's a type of Jewish libertarianism, but so it's not absolute individualism. It's to be balanced. It's libertarianism only to the extent that it doesn't contradict Jewish values or Jewish identity.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting by contrast when you think about libertarianism, I don't know, in America or somewhere like that. The discussion very often is challenging if you pick at it philosophically, because it's sometimes hard to pin people down as, what was the answer to the question: is libertarianism a practical recommendation that gets you the results that you want, or is it a moral principle that gets you the results you want by definition? So, because one kind of libertarianism, more sort of along the lines of Milton Friedman, when you are talking with him about details or something, is just that a lot of things, when you apply libertarian principles to them, can more easily flourish. Like that we make the mistake of thinking that we can fix a lot of social and economic problems by intervening with rules, but actually very often giving individuals the opportunities to use their own information and make their own decisions comes up with outcomes that maybe produce more wealth, or there's less distortion of prices or supplies or what have you. And so that kind of like Friedman, Hayek kind of argument for libertarianism, I think there's a lot of truth to that, and you see a lot of examples where that's the case. And so there is a kind of just a practical argument of, in a lot of cases, a certain amount of libertarianism of like getting out of the way and letting free individuals make decisions. You can diffuse information through a market better and oftentimes get a better result. I think that, I don't want to speak for Moshe Feiglin. I suspect that to some degree he probably would incline more in that direction, only in the sense that, well, he is not going to be someone who says, I'm a libertarian to such a degree that individual liberty trumps the Torah. Like, he doesn't take that position. If you ask him, he would say the Torah trumps other things. And so where the Torah disagrees with radical, individual liberty, you would go with the Torah. And so I suspect he would be someone who would point out the practical value of thinking in libertarian terms and critiquing things from a libertarian perspective in a lot of cases, and saying like, oh, do we really want dairy products to be produced and sold in the way that they are, in the state of Israel? Or could there be a different way that might lead to lower prices and higher quality and fewer shortages and whatever else? And so you can do that kind of thing. Although he might also say that he thinks that Torah, in many cases, is in favor of libertarian principles, and like, because the Torah is, that we should be learning that from the Torah. But yeah, like there are people who are more radically libertarian, and very often, in a way where they make an idol out of it, if you're looking at the American context, and they want to say basically, whatever happens once you give individuals as much liberty as possible to make their own decisions, that is the world that it is good to have. And there's no arguing about like, well, it would have been better if we'd done something different. Whatever you get from that condition is by definition the morally best outcome, because you've maximized liberty. And I think viewed through the lens of Torah, that's clearly a simplistic idolatry. But I don't think that the Torah therefore says, so wherever you feel like you want to garnish liberty a little bit, just go ahead and do that because it's too extreme or something to be libertarian. The Torah is, it is sometimes libertarian and sometimes anti-libertarian and 100% correct, but I think that you could still say about it that it leaves a lot of room for individual choice and freedom, and that seems to be a very strong value in it. So yeah, I don't know. I think that it wouldn't be fair to say that the Torah teaches libertarianism, but I think what people sometimes say in the reverse is wrong. I don't think the Torah teaches like statism or socialism or any of these other kind of isms of the 20th century by any stretch. And we're certainly being taught, in the example I'm trying to argue from the fruit, that there's some kind of balance to be had where you have affirmation of individualism, but then something that kind of binds everyone together. The last thing I'll just say is I don't know if that's only a consideration with respect to liberty per se. Like individualism isn't just about liberty, it's also about identity. It's about in the extreme where you don't have any liberty, I guess it's hard to express differences in identity. But the point is, it's also about like whether people feel like they're supported to be different from each other, or whether they're discouraged from being different from each other, or whether they are whether the things that make them unique are kind of celebrated, or whether they are ignored, or like people try to eliminate them. And those are all things that vary from society to society.
I was also thinking that in certain libertarian ideals might work more and be more necessary in the current cultural or climate, or within the current the framework of the current ethos of many Jews, whereas sometime maybe in 200 years from now, when Jews have a very different, perhaps will have a very different mentality than what they have today, then it'll be less relevant. And for example, when it comes to questions of neighborhoods, for example, which are almost completely secular, it may be much more productive to operate according to a libertarian principle right now, because that simply will work. Whereas in a situation where 80% of the people are already quite religious in the country, it might not be the most necessary modus vivendi.
Yeah, well, I mean, once you get down to the level of neighborhoods, also, people talk about libertarianism as whether it's really something that you should think about as being more important to apply in your approach to politics, the bigger the thing you're talking about is. Like, are you making laws about a whole country, or are you making rules for a street? Because generally we accept more kinds of specific constraints on how we operate when it starts to get down to the level of families or neighborhoods or things that are small, because people like to do certain things their way. Like, you can get people in a city or in a neighborhood or whatever to agree on certain rules about how buildings can be built, and it can be nice that they're all the same color, or that they all have to be different colors, or whatever else. And I think that, like, real estate is a great way of appreciating that sometimes rules that coerce people to some degree create shared spaces or atmospheres that sometimes people want. And if people want to get together in a compact and say, like, all right, let's all get together and make a sort of little territory where we say these are the rules for how you build buildings, it's hard to argue that that's always just like the greatest evil, and you want everyone to always be able to do whatever they want in their home as their castle or whatever. But it becomes much more clearly a bad idea to make one rule for everyone when it's, pertaining to millions of people stretched over many territories, many cities or many states or what have you. And so I think maybe this is a little bit of a tangent, but it reminds me actually, I think it's in Masechet Bava Batra, there's a discussion of something that struck me as a very non-libertarian economic regulation that we get from Chazal, which is talking about like the idea of a shuk, where you have a market, and someone let's say they're selling cherries or some fruit. We're back to the fruit again. So they have like a fruit stall in the market, and then someone else comes along and sets up a fruit stall right next to them, selling the same fruit for a lower price. And in that instance, you could say that this new guy with a new fruit stall who's just underbidding the guy right next to him, he's actually doing something wrong, because he's just like trying to take away the livelihood of the guy selling fruit right next to him. And that's a very non-libertarian economic regulation, because an economic libertarian would just say, no, I mean, of course you want competition, because that will lower the price for consumers. And if everyone competes all the time, like, people will find ways of participating in the market. And like, if my fruit stall goes out of business because of your fruit stall, then I'll go do something else. And it's good for everyone for me to be doing something else, because you're going to get that fruit that's cheaper, and I'm going to do something else with my time that, allows me to create value, that I don't have to, waste time selling expensive fruit. But there is an aspect of that story, which is kind of like the Milton Friedman version of the story. There's an aspect of that story that hides a bit of the cruelty of like saying, okay, if I come right next to you and I set up a fruit stall right next to yours, I'm driving you out of business. Maybe it's good for the consumer that they're getting cheaper fruit. And maybe also, once you find a new profession, you could argue that it was all for the best. But in the short term, there's a lot of destruction and pain and fear, and that are being caused by the fact that I'm making it so that a way you made your living no longer is available to you. And I puzzled over that. I remember when learning it, because I kind of, especially at the time, was inclined to notice the more kind of libertarian aspects of, let's say, the teachings of Chazal or the Torah. Like, for example, that still talking about fruit, we are much, the Torah certainly has things that are provisions to give food to the poor, but a lot of them are very passive, like with not picking the corners of your field, or not retrieving things that fall off your cart, or not beating the trees. So there's a sense of like trying to leave some things that are out there for people. But there isn't, which is to say that there seems to be a preference to some degree for the Torah, where possible, to do redistribution in a way that doesn't start by having the government go around and like take everyone's stuff and get it together in a big pot and then hand it out again. That you have to kind of like leave it in the field, so to speak, as much as possible, and leave it close to the individuals who are making decisions about what to do. But if you look at, so if you look at this fruit stall thing, it sounds like it's a very anti-libertarian regulation. But I think that the caveat that you would apply is that it cares about locality, which gets back to this thing we were saying about neighborhoods before. That it's true that you can say to someone, okay, you can't like set up a fruit stall right next to someone else and run them out of business. But it doesn't mean that like you're responsible for not selling fruit, because there's another fruit stall that exists in the world somewhere that maybe is selling fruit for a higher price. So the proximity matters. Like if you go right to the same place in the market and set up next to him, then maybe you could say, okay, you're trying to destroy this guy's livelihood. But if you, sell on a different market day or at a different location or whatever, in the same vicinity, it's less the case that it can be argued that you're directly trying to destroy someone's livelihood. And so I think that the balance that Halacha strikes there is caring about like how local this is. And I think that is a pretty common principle that you see, where like the more this is about you and your neighbor or you and your family, the more like there is kind of the possibility that halacha is in favor of things that look like coercion, or that look like you're not just simply free to do what's best for you, and you have to kind of take into account the people around you, and be constrained by them, and maybe be expected to coordinate with them in some way. And that is, not what you get from, I don't know, Ayn Rand or something. But I think there is obviously a much greater aspect of humanism in that bounded libertarianism, because there are ways for you to connect with other people in your neighborhood, in your family, in your nation, and coordinate with them that kind of save you from the isolation of pure individuality.
It also crossed my mind. I was thinking about that during the current election campaigns. Shas was making a big point of showing how they were the socially oriented party, and so I don't know exactly what they were referring to, but if they were talking about something along giving out food stamps, then the question emerges sort of related to what you were saying before. Maybe perhaps the Torah would prefer a situation of not forcibly taking money from the rich and then redistributing it to the poor via the government, but perhaps letting a very vibrant nonprofit sector work, where the nonprofit organizations take care of getting money to people who are in need. In any case, regardless of whatever is the correct balance between government action in this regard and non-government nonprofit organizations activity in this regard, it would seem that what's always important is to keep tabs on what the reality is on the ground. In other words, not relying on what they call, I remember that when Reagan was in power, I think that there were people that called Milton Friedman's ideas of voodoo, was it voodoo capitalism or something like
Voodoo
that?
economics, maybe.
Voodoo economics, right? So I think that anything can become an avodah zarah. The assumption of itself that you just let everybody, let the economy be totally free and everything work itself. I don't think there's any that can also become a type of idolatry. There's no need to assume one can go. One can. The emphasis can be on letting the nonprofit organizations take care of the poor. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be paying attention to see if it's actually working. And in the event that under a certain set of circumstances, for whatever the reason, it's not working, then the government might need to intervene. I think I think it's within the framework of Judaism. There's the obvious need to pay attention to what the reality is on the ground.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think the thing that I've seen in Chumash that maybe starts to hint at that aspect of it is in Stom V'Amorah, like this episode where Lot is bringing his guests, because Chazal have taught us that the problem with Stom was that they banned tzedakah, they banned giving of charity, but the question is, how did they ban giving of charity? Like, what was the problem exactly? How do you ban the giving of charity? Because one way of banning giving charity is you go and you find people who are giving away things and you try to punish them. But it also is an issue of, if you create a situation where the entire economy is under supervision and control, then there's no such thing as charity anymore, because no one has anything that belongs to them to give. So there is this kind of like Bolshevik version of reading Stone, where the problem in a sense is that the people, with a capital P, believe it's their right to know and keep track of and control everything that goes on in Stone. And that is not so far from the surface of the text, because you have this description. First of all, there's the verb leda'at that's being used, like to know, and we usually rush straight to like they want to rape the visitors of Lot, because leda'at et can refer to sexuality. Although interestingly, there's at least one instance in the Torah where it's not clear that it does, because that's used in the description of the relationship between Yosef and Paro. So unless you want to read sexuality into that relationship, I was just taking things in a different direction. It isn't always the case that the Torah is talking about sexuality when it uses the da'at et. And so when the people of Stone come, there's an explicit description that it's like young and old, and great and small, right? That there's everyone is there, all the people. There's this emphasis on the idea of like a mass democratic event where 100% of them are all sort of voting for this, so to speak, and they're demanding to know. Like they're saying the people demand to know about these guests and what's going on with Lot and his guests, and what he's giving to them. And so more maybe has to be done to build up, whether you buy that this is partly about economics, but we do have suggestion from Chazal that this is the case. But the point I wanted to make is that the people, the polity as a whole in Stone, when they're searching, right, they're blinded by sinvarim, by the sort of dazzling lights of the malachim, and they can't find the door to Lot's house. To me, one of the things that seems to be hiding in the background there is that there's something that's quite blind about the body politic as a whole. Like if you try to get them to do something as a whole, then there's a lot that they don't know, because actually individuals know things, and the collective knows much less, because it has much less of an ability to sort of codify and distribute information in a way that integrates all the different things that could be known by individuals. And this is Hayek's critique, which became Milton Friedman's critique of highly regulated markets, that when you try to do things like fixed prices, or when you try to do things like tell people when they can or can't buy things or what have you, you don't have enough information to do that in a way that lines up with how much is actually demanded of something and how much can be supplied and how difficult it is to get it from A to B and all these other things. And so prices are this way for a lot of information to get from one place to another, and for people to make decisions with good information. And if you don't let prices convey that information, then you get big economic problems of various kinds, like shortages or what have you. And so I think there is this element of, part of the problem is like whenever you ask the government to do something, the government doesn't do things. People do things at the behest of the government. And there are many situations in which once you have a highly regulated or very incorporated governmental body trying to do things, it will lack information and not be able to do it as well as a result. And that was relentlessly the argument of people like Hayek and Friedman, that I think is just a piece of chokhmah that's very universal. It's not like Torah per se, but I think it applies to human affairs in general. But I think that the Malachim in this episode in Stone, it seems so clear to me that like when the mob like can't even find the door to Lot's house, because they're somehow so unified as a whole in their approach to this situation that they certain details are just invisible to them. That seems to be something that's not so far from the surface of the text there. And I think that goes back to this issue of giving it tzedakah, that giving it tzedakah ideally is done individual to individual, because part of the mitzvah of giving tzedakah, and this is like an established thing in halacha, is to know that the person who's getting tzedakah really needs it, right? Like someone could, a complete spoiler could just like be a millionaire or whatever and decide to dress up and like go around and panhandle and get some extra money. I mean, that's like a very absurd situation to imagine. But the point is that if that happened, it wouldn't be to your merit that you're giving money to this person who doesn't need it and isn't actually deserving of tzedakah. And so that creates the onus on the person giving tzedakah to have some reason to think that he's actually successfully performing the mitzvah. But when you collectivize that act, you have, again, big problems with the flow of information. Like everyone sends their money to the government, and exactly by what process that money goes back out to people who need it is somewhat opaque and probably like horribly bureaucratically inefficient, and certainly not all the money gets spent on things that really could be called tzedakah, right? Like, is paying for television advertising of Bituach Leumi tzedakah, or is it like, you know, something else? Like they have a budget and they spend some of their money on that. So clearly there are those who would say, well, but if you don't use the government, that like the government solves a collective action problem, and they would try to argue that it makes certain things more efficient or it gets people to give tzedakah who wouldn't otherwise give it. But I think that's a very contentious claim, and you could easily make the case instead that if a society wants to be generous and help people in need, they don't need to be coerced into doing that by the government. Like if you let them keep their money instead of paying it in tax, they will give some of their money to help people in need. And that maybe they'll do a better job doing that because they will take more of an individual interest in it and be able to act like consumers and ask whether this like private organization that they're supporting is really doing a good job helping people. And that will create a much more vigorous market for, you know, providing for helping the needy, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think there's definitely room to argue that from the standpoint of Torah, maybe, you know, very centralized and kind of socialist arrangements like we have in the state of Israel might not necessarily be ideal halachically. But, you know, that being said, it's also certainly the case that some people do get helped by these mechanisms. And so one does hope that in the current situation that some of the income that goes to those kinds of things can be counted as tzedakah.
I was thinking that what you were saying about the benefit of local tzedakah having more of a sense of what people need as compared to some sprawling bureaucracy. It also that also can apply in a different type of way. It's not only in terms of the giver, that the local organization might have a better sense of who the actual poor people are, but it also may be that the poor people themselves are less inclined to lie about their situation to somebody they know locally as opposed to some faceless government.
Yeah, of course. I mean, once a government policy is in place, I think people much more so treat it as everyone has to just do the best they can to get along by taking advantage of the opportunities that are available to them. And even if no one's doing anything improper, it can still be the case that someone, you know, a large number of people will be kind of benefiting from an existing policy for reasons that are different than what it was originally created for, because you just get that when millions of people are all kind of optimizing their situation in a policy framework that's been established around
I
them.
mean, I was also thinking about, if we take an example of a person who has permanent physical handicaps, or let's say a person who is, I don't know, 70 or 80%, if we can put it that way, incapable of functioning physically. So is it better for the government to provide that type of person with a permanent stipend, or would that also be better, ideally, to have that done on the local level?
Yeah, I mean, it starts to enter into considerations that are very specific to the case. And I think what the interesting thing to me is just there's a lot that we can learn from halakha and from our tradition and how we approach these issues. And I don't think that means that halakha provides a ready-made handbook for how to write laws in the present day. There's a lot you can do now with technology and other things that present certain kinds of opportunities. So you need to come up with solutions that are like appropriate to the present moment, but it does seem like there's, trying to really understand how these things are understood in the tradition and say, like, what is the wisdom in that? And also, how do we figure out which way is up? Like, where do our standards come from for what a success looks like? I think there's really an argument for that. Like, even just like the word tzedakah, what's interesting is that it does appear a few times in the Torah itself. But I mean, especially maybe the most striking appearance with respect to this particular issue is there's this case that's described of a individual who's borrowed money and from their creditor, and they have as collateral they've given their garment as some kind of collateral or pledge, and there's this mitzvah. So it says, "Hashiv tashiv lo et ha'avot kevo hashemesh v'shachav besalmato uve'orcheka ulecha tehiyeh tzedakah lifnei Adonai Elohecha." So, in principle, he's given you as some kind of collateral this garment of his. But the point is, you can't say, well, you owe this to me until you give me back my money, because he needs something to sleep in. So you have to give it to him so that he can sleep in it, and then he'll give it back to you in the morning. And then this action is called tzedakah. And what's interesting, I don't know, there's several things that are interesting about it. One of them is that it's not a sort of a transfer of a good that just goes one way. In that sense, it's different than like Maser Sheni or something like that. It's not just like a tithe from your income where you say, like, I have this much wealth and I'll take a chunk of it, I'll give it to someone else. The actual case where the word tzedakah is used in the Torah is it's talking about a kind of a consideration between individuals who are they're already entangled in this agreement where someone has loaned someone else money, and that is not being resolved at this moment. And now there's this question of what you do with the collateral. If the collateral is someone's like bedclothes or whatever, do you like refuse to let them have it at night or something? Or do you just hold on to it during the day but give it back to them at night? So there's this kind of this emphasis on the decency between individuals who already in other ways are transacting or sort of entangled or involved with each other. And obviously that kind of character to the interaction is the first thing that just gets erased by centralization of helping those in need, right? Because that kind of consideration cannot be shown by a large institution because it would immediately be exploited, right? There's no way you can tell a giant organization handling millions or billions of shekels or dollars or whatever that you should just like let people have their collateral back whenever they want it, because then a certain percentage of them will just like default on the loan and run away because you did that. And by the numbers, you're just creating a situation that invites people to abuse a faceless system. But when it's between individuals, that becomes the meaning of tzedakah, is to show that kind of consideration in the lashon of the Torah itself. And I find that very striking.
Okay, so thank you for all your time, Dr. England, and looking forward to seeing you next time. And Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov. Thank you.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.